Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Information Study 753, Preserving Information Media lecture, in which we will be focusing on audiovisual materials. So a couple of weekly topics for this week. How should AV materials be preserved, and which aspects of AV preservation can make it more difficult than other types? Okay, so essentially what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the different unique risks posed by audiovisual materials when it comes to preservation, and discuss them a little bit and relate them to the different principles that the Harvey and Mahar article that we looked at in week one uh, describe as being applicable to preservation. Some of the principles are fairly specific to particular risks. Some of them are ones that overlap between a few different risks to AV materials. And so, yeah, we'll just kind of go through and see what connections there are. Okay, so we'll start by talking about the difficulty involved in identifying audiovisual materials. And this is particularly problematic for the preservation of audiovisual materials because, as we'll talk about in just a minute, the endpoint of audiovisual material preservation is a transfer to a digital medium. However, archives may have so many audiovisual materials in their repository, ideally they're aware of all the ones that they have, but determining exactly what is on those audiovisual materials can be difficult. So you can't really look at a cassette tape and know what's on that cassette tape without listening to that cassette. Now there may be some kind of labeling or other information attached to the record, but as the Harry article from a previous discussion about preservation assessment noted, these kinds of labels aren't always accurate. And what is written on the label of a cassette or of a VHS tape as being the content may not be what the actual content is. And so, it takes time to listen to an entire cassette. One cassette might be 90 minutes long. One VHS tape might contain a couple of hours worth of video. But in order to really know what the content of these materials are, again, assuming that they're not thoroughly and accurately described on the label or in some other way, can take a lot of time. And that's assuming that archives are able to locate and use information, or locate and use hardware that is required to play audiovisual materials, which, as we'll talk about in a little bit, isn't always the case. So appraisal is necessary, but it can certainly be problematic with archives for a variety of reasons. And this also harkens back to our discussion of preservation assessment. And oftentimes there may be hidden AV materials in a collection, and it may take a preservation survey or some kind of in-depth assessment to find out what AV materials actually exist, which collections there are, and additionally what information is contained on them. So it can be a lot of difficulty just identifying the content of audiovisual materials. Of course, this differs from a letter where you can just pick up a letter and read it, and you have a pretty good idea of what is on a letter or a book or some other a variety of other types of analog materials. So which of our general and specific principles can we connect this difficulty in identifying content with? So a good one here is collaboration is necessary to ensure preservation. So collaboration with the donor to find out to as much detail as possible what is on audiovisual materials that they may be donating to the archive. That can certainly take some of the sting out of having to identify this stuff later on when you're trying to determine what you should really prioritize for digital transfer and long-term preservation. Another good one to look at is the specific principle of appraisal is necessary and desirable. If you do appraisal, then ideally you have a good idea of what is on audiovisual materials, because if you don't, then otherwise, how are you appraising them as being worthy of inclusion in archives? So that is certainly a principle that would attach to this this specific problem of audiovisual preservation as well. Another interesting one to attach to this problem is preservation action should adhere to ethical considerations. Obviously, you don't want to attempt to identify AV materials that may be difficult to identify and misidentify them or misrepresent the people or the events or communities or cultures represented on AV materials. And it may be that an archivist is not from a community that is documented in audiovisual materials, and so they may not really know what they're looking at or what they're listening to. But if they say, well, this is this, but that's actually incorrect, and it results in a community being portrayed in a false or maybe even negative light, then that can be harmful for the community. And obviously, that's something that should be avoided because that's really not an ethical thing for an archivist to do. So if you are going to attempt to carry out this, the identification of the content on AV materials, ideally you do so in an ethical and as accurate a manner as possible. Okay, so next we will talk about the expense of transferring. So again, as a couple of our articles noted for this week, the end point of AV preservation is a transfer to the digital medium. The Lewis article called it as being vital for AV preservation. The Hill article touches on it as well. And it really is a requirement for audiovisual preservation. So as the Lewis article notes, when archivists go to transfer digital materials, they really have one of two options. They can either attempt to develop their own AV transfer capabilities, which involves purchasing equipment, having staff that are trained to do that kind of transfer, and just even having the space to set up a transfer operation can be beyond the means of a lot of archives. And of course, the other option is to have a vendor do the transfer for the archives. And that can be expensive as well. So the Lewis article throws out a cost of $60 to $120 per item. If you consider a single collection might have, 5 cassettes, that can really add up just within a small collection with a small amount of AV materials. And as Lewis notes, once you create a digital representation of AV materials, you still need to house and preserve the master record. So you would go ahead and preserve the record or cassette or wherever where that digital transfer came from as well. So that's some expense that is going to continue on into the future. Of course, transferring into a digital format also creates a digital record that has to be preserved in the long term as well. So, you know, we've talked about some of the expenses associated with that in this course also. So archivists can take some steps to reduce the expense of AV transfer. Lewis mentioned collaborations between archives, which may reduce digitization costs. So if there's some kind of reduction by a vendor, if archives kind of band together and put in an order for 100 cassettes, then maybe they might get some kind of discount for a bulk order. It may be possible for one archive to develop AV transfer capabilities and give other archives discounts for using those facilities. So something maybe not as profit driven as some vendors might be, and that might result in a reduction in the cost of transfer. And Lewis also talks about the possibility of archives asking collection donors for funds to transfer and care for the records. So if a donor has the interest and the financial capability in paying for the transfer of audiovisual materials to digital format, then that's something that the archives might consider asking about as well. So what are some of the principles we can attach to this challenge of digital preservation? We can certainly look at, again, the idea of collaboration, which we touched on. So collaboration between archives, collaboration between the archive and the donor. Advocacy is one that we've talked a lot about in this course. Archives can just attempt to demonstrate the need to preserve audiovisual materials and the need to transfer them into a digital format for their long-term preservation. Another interesting one is it is necessary to distinguish clearly between objects and the information they carry. So being able to, in some ways, understand that because of the fragility of AV materials and the possibility of hardware obsolescence related to AV materials, which we'll talk about in a minute, you know, this expense is necessary and this transfer is necessary. And the archives should really be focused on just the contents of audiovisual materials and not, at least in the long term, the containers that they are on. So some specific principles, again, appraisal is necessary and desirable. The better you do appraisal, the better you are able to determine which records really have value and should be brought into your repository. And you know, the fewer records you're going to need to transfer down the road. Or the better idea you'll have about which records you want to absolutely make sure that you go to the expense of transferring and which ones are further down on the priority list. Looking at a couple of other specific principles, preservation actions should not exceed the abilities of the personnel who apply them. So again, you want to have trained people doing these kinds of transfers. You need to have staff that know what they're doing on equipment that they know how to use. And if you have people that don't know how to use equipment and don't know how to do transfers, then they may damage the records that they're working with. And obviously that's not ideal. And that's also is related to preservation actions should not harm the object. Preservation actions should be documented. So you'll want to document which of your records have been transferred to digital format, just so you have some kind of knowledge of that. And as we'll talk about later on, you should also document what that transfer looked like and sort of under what conditions the transfer took place. Okay, so the next one that we'll look at is fragility. And AV materials are particularly fragile, especially when you compare them to paper records, and they are more susceptible to deterioration caused by poor storage conditions, physical harm just from being played. You know, if you start and stop a cassette, that's a pretty violent act. Putting film through a reel-to-reel player, you know, causes it to heat up, and there are a variety of different physical dangers to audiovisual records. So because of this, it's more important that audiovisual materials are kept in an environment in which they are going to thrive into the future. And so this may involve climate-controlled storage, which is more expensive than just kind of letting the environment be what it might be. And of course, you need to monitor the environment as well, and that takes additional staff time and equipment and other resources on the part of the archive as well. And the Hill article actually does a really good job of talking about some of the different problems that can be associated with AV records if they aren't in the right environment. So humidity is definitely a big problem. And again, you know, being able to control the amount of moisture in the air in a building can be pretty cost prohibitive for a lot of archives. In addition to environmental controls, as the Library of Congress Care Handling and Storage of Audiovisual Materials notes, audiovisual materials often require padded or specialized containers, as well as special shelving. And they may also require special handling. And so staff and patrons need to know how to handle audiovisual materials. So again, this fragility can result in more complications for archives just from the everyday storage and handling of audiovisual records. So which of our principles can we apply the fragility of audiovisual materials to? I think a good one, well, is always advocacy. You know, you need to advocate for the importance of climate-controlled stacks and environmental monitoring. So that's certainly a applicable one. Taking preservation action now is better than doing nothing. So even if your AV materials have been in a condition that might have caused some deterioration, that doesn't mean you should just say, well, you know, that's it, game over. Nothing we do now will help them. You know, if you take records that haven't been stored in a good condition and you put them in a good condition, it may not necessarily repair the damage, but it will slow the deterioration that those records are the deterioration that those records have experienced in the past. Preservation requires active managed care. Again, you need to actively monitor the conditions that your AV materials are in. A really applicable one is understanding the structure of materials is the key to understanding what preservation actions to take, as materials contain the seeds of their own destruction or inherent vice. So just knowing why particular AV materials are fragile and what dangers they might face and what environmental standards are best for them is it's important knowledge to have, because you know that's really going to determine how you focus your efforts on preserving AV materials into the future. Looking at specific principles, again, appraisal is necessary and desirable. If someone is offering you AV records and you know that they're very fragile, you know that they might already be in a condition that makes them even more fragile, maybe they haven't been cared of well in the past, then that might lead you to say, okay, well, we can't really preserve these, so we're not going to accept them. Another good one is preservation actions should be documented. So it's a good idea to document what conditions your AV materials are in. That way you have some record indicating what conditions AV materials have been in the past, so that you may have some understanding of how much records might have decayed over time, or how much records might have decayed since they came into your repository. So just having that background information can really be helpful for an archives, just to have some idea of sort of the past environment that an AV record has been in, and how that might impact the condition of the record itself. Okay, so moving on, we'll talk about hardware obsolescence, which is another reason for the need to transfer AV records at the end of the day. So some of the equipment required to access the content of AV materials is either obsolete now or is at risk of becoming obsolete. And so this is something also that the Harry article that we read before mentioned about how students didn't even know what cassettes or VHS tapes were. They hadn't really experienced them or used them in their lives, and how that was an indication to BYU's archives that, okay, we really need to focus on doing something about this type of AV record, because they truly are quickly becoming an obsolete carrier, and the equipment to use them is quickly becoming obsolete as well. So because of this risk of hardware obsolescence, again, not only is transfer important, but you need to be aware of which materials you have that depend on obsolete or nearly obsolete hardware to be accessed. So if you have records that are on wax cylinders, you should obviously be aware of that and have some plan to do something about that, because wax cylinder players aren't exactly falling from the trees these days. So this threat of hardware obsolescence really requires archivists to have a better understanding of what records they have in their repository. So again, getting back to the idea of some kind of preservation assessment, and requires archives to have some plan for how they are going to deal with the threat of hardware obsolescence in the future. Okay, so looking at our principles here, a good one to attach to the idea of hardware obsolescence is taking preservation action now is better than doing nothing. So you don't want to wait until you get to the point where, whoa, we have this type of AV material, and we just suddenly realize that it's very difficult to find the film projector that plays this kind of film, or the the 8-track player that is going to make this 8-track accessible. So it's just a good idea to know what you have and be proactive about moving on to a medium, ideally digital, that is going to allow that content to be accessible into the future. Another good one to connect to the idea of hardware obsolescence is necessary to distinguish clearly between the objects and the information they carry. You have to understand that the object itself may be on a medium or format that is obsolete or nearly obsolete, but you can still save the content and make that easily accessible, again, by transferring the content to a digital format. Again, appraisal is necessary and desirable. Ideally, you shouldn't be bringing records into your archive that are on or in formats that are obsolete or nearly obsolete. So that's something that you should really consider when you're doing appraisal. Okay, so the next one that we'll talk about is legal issues, and this is certainly one that keeps a lot of archivists up at night. The Hill article talks about how copyright laws are a concern related to AV reformatting and preservation, and that they may prevent archives from making access copies of audiovisual materials. And this can be particularly challenging because, as Lewis notes, grants may require open access to preserved materials. So it may be a part of a grant that says, if we're going to give you money for this, then you have to make these records easily accessible to the public, but they may violate copyright materials. So if archives are depending on grant funding in order to pay for the expense of a digital transfer, then copyright laws might get in the way of archives fulfilling their obligations under that grant. Additionally, archives may not be aware of copyrighted materials that they have uh, in their repository. They may not know that audiovisual materials have some kind of copyright on them, and this is especially true if they're having difficulty identifying the content of AV materials again, which may be a problem, as we talked about earlier on in this lecture. So what are some principles we can attach to legal issues? A good connection is collaboration is necessary to ensure preservation. So archives may collaborate with donors to actually acquire copyright over audiovisual records, assuming that the donor has the copyright to those records. So that's one way that archives can make all the copies that they want, can fulfill the obligations or the terms that granting agencies like to see, and acquire the resources needed to preserve AV materials into the future. A part of that is the next one on this list: advocacy is necessary to ensure preservation. I think donors might feel more comfortable giving copyright to archives that they value and trust, and that they feel like are going to be uh, responsible stewards of the records and of the copyright. And advocacy can go a long way towards making that positive impression of archives a reality. Again, you can connect the idea to appraisal is necessary and desirable. If you don't want to deal with the headache associated with copyrighted AV records, then you should really take steps to find out which records in a collection that you're appraising might have copyright on them, and either say, okay, well, this is mostly collections, so we're not interested, or we only want to take records that either aren't copyrighted or that we know we can get the copyright for. Okay, and so the last one that we'll look at is a loss due to reformatting. So again, we talked about the inevitability of the transfer to digital medium as being the long-term preservation destiny for audiovisual materials, but it's important to note that reformatting can result in a loss of quality or a loss of information. So as you take something and transfer it from a vinyl record to a digital format, it's possible that some of the warm tones and other uh, factors that make vinyl records sound so great, not to age myself, can be lost, and that can result in an overall decrease in the value of the record. So that's something that archives really need to be aware of and consider when they are when they are reformatting audiovisual materials. So part of the way that archives can deal with this is by using quality equipment, as the Hill article notes, by using qualified staff who know how to do these transfers correctly and in a way that won't result in a loss of information or in a loss of quality. Hill also mentions that archives should have the bit depth and sampling rate defined when they are determining and setting up how AV materials are going to be transferred into a digital format or how they're going to be reformatted. And those steps can go a long way towards decreasing the amount of information lost due to reformatting. So there are a few general and specific principles that we can connect this problem associated with AV preservation as well. So advocacy is necessary to ensure preservation. Again, having skilled staff or equipment that can prevent a loss of information during reformatting costs time and it costs money. And so advocacy is required to really get both of those things. The idea of preservation action should not exceed the abilities of the personnel who apply them. So again, you want skilled staff members who are able to carry out these transfers in a way that doesn't result in a loss of quality and a loss of the significant properties of records that make them valuable to researchers. Preservation action should aim at the highest quality possible. Again, you want this transfer to result in the least amount of lost information as possible, and that really will result in records that retain the highest level of quality that they can. So kind of relatedly, preservation action should not harm the object. Ideally, you avoid a loss during reformatting at all, and if you really think about it, if there is a loss during reformatting, that is harming the object. Preservation actions should be documented, so you should have documentation of the circumstances or conditions under which reformatting took place, and that way you can give that information to researchers or other interested parties so that they know exactly what the sampling rate or the bit depth of the digital transfer that they're listening to was, and thus they can have more of an indication of how authentic what they're listening to actually is, and if it is a close representation of the original record when it was recorded to vinyl or cassettes or whatever it was recorded to, or if they're listening to something that may have changed quite a bit during reformatting, which again is not the ideal. Okay, so we'll go ahead and call it a lecture there. I'm interested in knowing which unique challenges you feel audiovisual preservation poses. If you can think of some that I didn't mention in this lecture, or if you think of some connections between the ones that I did mention and the principles in the Harvey and Mahart article, please feel free to mention them, however you want to. I am curious about your opinion and your perspective. And obviously, please let me know as well if you have any questions about anything in this lecture. So as always, thank you and have a great week.